Hello, my name is John Ryan from SQT Training. Today I'm going to talk to you about Lean Six Sigma in general and Lean Six Sigma Green Belt in particular. First though, let me give you some of my own background. In the early part of my career, I worked in the automotive industry, first in Ireland and then in the US, working mainly in quality assurance. As a quality manager in a large automotive plant in Los Angeles, I found myself involved in a good deal of process improvement initiatives. It was here that I got the training and experience in Lean Six Sigma to drive process improvement. Coming back to Ireland in 2001, I discovered that there was an appetite for Lean and Six Sigma, but not that many people with the sort of hands-on experience that I had in leading a continuous improvement program. I joined SQT Training in 2002 and was part of a team that put together a suite of training programs in Lean and Six Sigma specifically for Irish industry. Since then, I've trained and mentored a large number of Lean Six Sigma practitioners. In the early days, we didn't track project savings from each cohort we trained. We started that formal tracking about 10 years ago. However, I can estimate I've mentored about 1,000 projects, mainly green and black belt level, and I can estimate the combined annualized savings from those projects to be well in excess of 100 million euros. In this presentation, I'm going to give you some background on Lean Six Sigma, and then the bulk of my presentation will be about the engine of most Lean Six Sigma programs, which is the Green Belt practitioner. I'll talk about the skills that are being developed by a Green Belt, about the projects that Green Belt practitioners would be expected to complete, and about the disciplined approach and tools that the Green Belt practitioner learns and practices in order to demonstrate his or her competency. And finally, I'll walk you through the different options that there are out there regarding Green Belt training and the commitment that will be required in order to become a successful Green Belt practitioner. I'll leave you then with some tips to help you should you decide that Green Belt is something you'd be interested in pursuing. First of all, let me give you a little bit of background about SQT. As you can see, we've been around quite a while. We're based in Limerick, and though all our training we deliver is either on-site or in hotels. So while we're seen as a private college like Griffith College, we're actually a virtual college without a campus. Outside of CI training, we provide a broad range of training driven specifically by Irish industry needs. In the Lean Six Sigma space specifically, we have a team of 6 highly qualified tutors with a combined experience in Lean Six Sigma of close to 100 years. Our customer base spans every industry sector, including public sector and semi-state bodies. You can see some of the brands on the left. We support our customers from initial deployment of their Lean Six Sigma program until the point that they feel comfortable or are fully self-sufficient. And even then, we're often asked to take a role in the training while they focus on the project delivery. With this model, we tend to partner with our customers for many years, many of our customers being with us for 5 or 10 years. Okay, let's start by asking why would a company undertake continuous improvement? So while CI is hugely beneficial in giving organizations the structure and discipline to improve their processes and deliver on strategic goals, it's also quite a difficult program to implement, as it seeks to drive the culture of the organization to become more customer-centric, data-driven, and reflective than it may be from the outset. The challenge faced is in the conflict between doing what's right for the organization and what's urgent at any point in time in the organization. It's that conflict between the urgent and the important that requires the most attention if an organization is to be successful in implementing a continuous improvement program. Usually the conflict is most evident in the middle management and supervisory roles within the organization. These are the people who are fighting the fires and feeling the heat. And if these people can't see the value in freeing up time to try to understand and fix the source of their fires, then it'll be difficult to get any project delivered. Therefore, while we're going to talk today about the tools and techniques that a Green Belt will learn, you need to remember that no Green Belt will be successful without management support and strong leadership. And it's important that the governance of the program and the support structures are put in place well in advance of the training program itself. This model here shows the deployment of a CI program. and the time it takes to get to the point where we're even ready to talk about training and projects. So you see there's a lot of work that generally happens in advance of getting to the point where we can start talking about training green belts. While there's, I suppose, a lot of different titles out there for CI programs, we come across them in the form of operational excellence, business excellence, BPI, Agile, Six Sigma, Lean or Lean Six Sigma. They're all basically doing more or less the same thing. They're all using more or less the same methodology and more or less the same suite of tools and structures. Okay, so we'll start by looking at what Lean and Six Sigma bring and what are the key concepts. Initially, I suppose Lean and Six Sigma were separate programs. And even today, if you go into the American Society for Quality website, you'll find that they treat them as separate entities. Lean is one entity and Six Sigma is another entity. Now, in reality, most companies and most CI programs have considered these to be one and the same. While Lean is all about value recognition, reduction and elimination of waste, streamlining the process, and speeding up the process. Six Sigma looks more at the outputs of the process, looks at defects in the process, looks at controlling the process, making it more predictable, reducing the variability, so making it more accurate process. And of course, if you're going to do either a Lean or a Six Sigma project, you're going to be looking at a process. You're going to be doing a lot of the same things, talking to a lot of the same people, collecting a lot of the same data. So it does make sense to have both Lean and Six Sigma competencies to do this. We'll give a little bit of background to Lean first of all, then we'll talk about Six Sigma. So Lean, as you're probably aware, comes from Toyota, and the focus, I suppose, of Lean is identified in these 5 principles, which comes from the book Lean Thinking. And I suppose the key emphasis is on the distinction between value and waste. So what does the customer value? If we specify the value of the customer, it means we know what they're willing to pay for and also what they'll pay more for. And of course, if we know what they value, then we also know what they don't value. And of course, what they don't value, we term waste. So looking at the value stream, that's how we see the product or service being delivered to the customer. And making value flow without interruption is basically taking out the waste, eliminating the bottlenecks, the obstacles to flow. Allowing customers to pull from the producer, that's really about connecting customers and suppliers all the way through the supply chain. So even internally in our organizations, we have customers and suppliers, and we try and connect those to ensure that everybody knows what their customer requirements are, and everybody's is, I suppose, focusing on meeting those requirements. And lastly, of course, within any continuous improvement program, there's always an emphasis on continuing to look ahead and what can we do next, what can we do better, that relentless pursuit of perfection. To look at Lean and boil it down, it's really a process-focused thing, and it's really looking at efficiencies and speed in the process. And Taiichi Ono here is an architect of Lean at Toyota, and he always talks about the timeline. And if we look at different value streams, we have things like order to cash, concept to launch, or dock to dock value streams. And what we do is we look at the timeline and we try and break it into the value-add activities and the non-value-add activities, so that we can say how much of the time in delivering the process, the product or service, is spent doing value-added activities. Here's an example from an outpatient clinic in a Dublin hospital. So we can see that this clinic, the average patient experience time is 3 hours 17 minutes. But in that, the combination of that time includes lots of time sitting around waiting to be called for the next activity. If we were to strip out all the waiting time, we would see that the total value-added time for the patient is less than an hour, and therefore the target for any Lean project in the hospital would be to tackle and eliminate the waiting, so minimize that waiting, and also then to try and speed up the flow of value, maybe bring that 58 minutes down even further, and to see what else we could do in that 58 minutes to add value for the patient. If we look at Six Sigma, on the other hand, Six Sigma has its roots in, I suppose, electronics service industry, Motorola in particular, then further developed by likes of GE and Allied Signal. And in some ways, Six Sigma was a response to Lean, because it was, I suppose, the influx of cheap electronic, high quality electronics into the US market that prompted Motorola to respond. And their response was to develop a program, and that was a very systematic type program. Took them a while to get there, but the end result was what we know as Six Sigma, which has evolved, I suppose, even since then. And that was in the mid-80s. So what does Six Sigma do? Well, it provides us with a disciplined, data-based approach to process improvement. So very structured and very, I suppose, project-oriented. That's a little bit different to Lean, because Lean is often seen as more a mindset or a way of thinking, trying to understand what's value and what's waste. And I suppose Six Sigma uses a methodology called the DMAIC methodology, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And of course, the data, we talk about gathering data so that we take out opinion and we focus on the facts. And this allows us basically to avoid, I suppose, conflicts where it's my opinion versus your opinion, and we focus on what the big hitters are, driven by the data. A key concept in the Six Sigma world is this thing called the process equation, and basically it's a transfer function. So the process equation, y equals f of x, is y is the dependent variable, and the x's are all the independent variables. They're all the inputs to making a good y. Our y's today we know as KPIs. So they're the lag metrics for our processes, and we measure those and we respond to those. However, if we want to really understand and I suppose be able to make our y's predictable and repeatable, we need to not wait for things to go wrong and tackle one particular x or another particular x that might be responsible. We need to look at all of the variables, all of the x's, and then understand the relationship between the x's and y's. And we do that by creating a model. Often this model is actually a statistical model, and we can create that and use that to optimize the process and make the process more predictable. Another thing about Six Sigma is the, I suppose, discipline methodology we talked about. And this is the project-based approach. Now, initially, when Motorola developed this, they were looking at quality problems, and their methodology was basically a measure, analyze, improve, control. It was a plan, do, check, act type approach based on what we know as the DMAIC cycle. However, of course, when it went out of Motorola and into organizations like GE that do a lot of different things, they have white goods, they have financial services, they own the NBC, the television station, and of course problems there in some of those industries mightn't be as obvious, and there mightn't be a Pareto chart to start off the project. So the define phase was really a phase to help define the opportunities, define the problem, and it really was a project planning phase. Measure and analyze really are the research phases of our projects. And Lean Six Sigma projects, or Six Sigma projects, I suppose, they generally are what we call research projects, and you usually start out not knowing what the source of the problem is. They're often repetitive issues that we keep firefighting. And with the measure and analyze phase, what we try and do is gather all the information, whittle it down, look at the relationships, come up with some theories, test those theories, and then I suppose come up with a short list. The improve phase is where most of the action and implementation takes place. Now, in the measure and analyze phase, we might have quick wins and we would implement those immediately. But in the improve phase, generally we break it into innovation and implementation. So some of the things that we're trying to fix might be challenging, and therefore the usual way of thinking about it mightn't result in a sustainable solution. So by using innovation techniques, we can find different ways to solve the problem, and sometimes that helps us to come up with maybe easier solutions, or solutions that we wouldn't have otherwise thought about. And then it's just about implementation and bringing people along with us, risk management, change control, all of those things. In the control phase, basically what we're trying to do is monitor the solution, monitor the performance. The end of the improve phase is our key date for planning a project. We often call it the saving start date. That's our go live to the big action. So the control phase really is just a period of time in which we're allowing the solution to bed down. We're monitoring, we're ensuring that that the handover has gone well and that the controls are working. And of course, we're collecting data to demonstrate the impact of the solution. So together, these are called the DMAIC methodology. So DMAIC methodology. Now, the levels of training that go along with the practitioner, originally when it came out of Motorola, I suppose this didn't have a nice, slick name like a black belt or green belt. They were called, I don't know what they called, process experts or process characterization experts. That's what they were called. But as it spread to other companies, they were looking for a better way of distinguishing between the levels of training. So the karate and martial arts terminology was picked up. So we talk about green belts as the main engine of delivery. So that's the people who are working in their own area, who are subject matter experts, and who deliver a lot of their projects in their own area. They're supported by yellow belts, who are also team members in that area. Sometimes yellow belts do projects in their own right, and these are smaller, quicker projects. And usually the yellow belts and the green belts are mentored by black belts. So an organization might have a small number of black belts to mentor and support the green and yellow belts. And again, the black belt training in itself is a lot more than the green belts. All projects have a sponsor. They have a champion. It's different terminology in different industries or different companies. And the sponsor or champion basically is often the business owner. That's the person for whom this project needs to be delivered. And of course, the person who controls the resources, the person who owns the metric, the person who's feeling the pain. And generally then we often have this thing called white belt awareness training, which is just for everybody so that they know what's going on and they're aware of the projects that are happening around them. So next we'll talk about the skill set of a green belt. So many of the people that come to us for green belt training are already working on process improvement initiatives. They're already doing, a lot of good work in that area, but they mightn't have any formal recognition, and they mightn't have received any formal training. So there may be tools that they're relying on for everything, and if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So you use that tool for every scenario. So what we try and do is give them a broader range of tools and help them with the skill sets that they mightn't have developed. So skill sets around project management, team leadership and facilitation, change management, which of course is critical for these type of projects. And a key skill there is around influencing upwards within the organization and even influencing downwards at all levels within the organization, and stakeholder engagement, bringing people along with us. In some industries, there's a much more focus on data. So service industries, for example, you wouldn't have as much focus on data. It'd be the more focus would be on people. Whereas in, let's say, heavy manufacturing or industries, let's say like call centers, we would have a lot more data, and therefore our decision making would be a lot more data based. So learning the tools, graphical and statistical, to help us make those decisions would be a key part of developing the competency of a green belt. And of course then there are specific lean tools for identifying waste in a process. To get started, a green belt will need a project. And one of the challenges that we face from organizations starting out is getting them to identify what are suitable projects for a green belt. So the first thing is it must be a very clear, narrowly focused problem or opportunity. So it must be something that has an urgent need. So there's evidence of pain, there's a potential benefit, there's a customer looking for this. The metrics have to be clear, so we have to know what the start and end point is. We have to be able to set a baseline. The goals need to be realistic and measurable. And of course, we need a process. And ideally, for green belts, we're looking at existing processes and solving the problems or improving the existing processes. I talk about a group of projects there in the exception called data-based projects or data projects. These are things like tackling absenteeism or reducing electricity spend or energy spends or reducing waste in general. So with those, there mightn't be one particular process responsible for the problem. It might be a combination of processes, or it might be just the culture of the organization. And in which case, the project is all about following the data, finding what the big hitters are, and dealing with those. Underneath here, I won't go through them, but there's a list of some basic criteria. Obviously, things like being able to save money, being manageable. Obviously, the other thing is that these projects should be doable projects within a reasonably short time frame. So this is not a marathon, it's a sprint. So we're trying to get the organization on board for a reasonably short period of time. And when I say short, I'm talking 4 to 6 months. But any longer than that, and you'll find the organizational attention span will dwindle, and other things will become more important. In selecting the right projects for Greenbelt in particular, we want to make sure that we avoid the just do it projects, which are things that have an obvious answer, or things that we know what the cause of the problem is, we know what the solution is. There's no real uncertainty there. In that case, it's a just do it. We give it to somebody, and there's no need to form a team. There's no need to go through the DMAIC methodology. If you did that, it would actually slow down your delivery and tie up your resources unnecessarily. On the other end, we're always looking to avoid the world hunger projects and boiling the ocean. And that's one of the biggest problems with projects that we see, is that often, I suppose, when you ask the process owner or the senior management team what would they like, they often say, we'd like everything. We'd like you to fix everything, and we'd like it tomorrow, please. But we then have to go and say, well, that's not possible and that's not realistic. So let's pull that back and let's see what we can do within the time period, and focus on the big hitters. So Greenbelt projects are those big hitters that can be delivered within a reasonable amount of time. And from there, we can leverage the findings into other areas. So we can eat the elephant chunk by chunk. We can get there in I suppose, in generations of projects. Usually these projects have a selection process behind them. And in mature organizations where they've got a good governance system, they would use a number of different sources to generate projects. Now, the projects would come from management, they would come top down. They could also come bottom up from suggestion schemes. They could come from outside, from customer complaints. They could come from just monitoring our KPIs, looking at trends. So lots of different ways that the projects come in. Generally, though, the governance structure would be such that we need to filter out those projects that are not suitable for a Lean Six Sigma project. So capital and IT projects, they're basically infrastructure projects that go through your typical PMO office. And then when we look at the problems and opportunities sides, we have to filter out the just do it's, and things like what we call CAPAs are that's a term for corrective action and preventive action, which is basically when you have a complaint or a failure, and there's usually a single thing behind it. Somebody changed something, and they're usually shorter in duration and quite formal. So whereas we can do we can tackle a CAPA through a DMAIC project, often there's a methodology there already that's kind of a parallel, and these projects would go through that process. And then underneath, we look for the yellow belt and the green belt projects, and a note there at the bottom, must be aligned to business objectives. Obviously, the projects have to be aligned to the goals and objectives of the organization, or they won't be supported, and again, we'll flounder in the project. Next, we look at the DMAIC journey, and we look, first of all, I suppose, at the plain English common sense approach. So under each of these sections, each phase we call them, there's a set of objectives. So in the define phase, we read through those. We talk about, project planning type activities, defining the goal, getting the team together, scoping, getting the customer requirements, making sure they're clear, identifying who the stakeholders are, who are the players, which of these players has, I suppose, has something against their interest in this project. In other words, we might be giving them more work, or they might feel ownership of the previous or the current process. In the measure phase, we get into gathering the data, talking to the people, observation, walking the process, engaging the experts, brainstorming, looking around for things that we can do immediately. What's obvious? What are the things we can do immediately? So if we think about the measure phase, what we're doing is we're looking at the current state and we're getting the knowledge and the data, and we're putting those together, as well as our own observations. And sometimes when we put them together, they agree and they point to a particular area, and other times they disagree. So when we have disagreements, then we've got to decide, okay, which is correct? Is it what the people are telling us, or is it what the data is pointing to? So we have to tease those out. We have to do some tests. We come up with theories. We challenge the conventional wisdoms of where we think that maybe the people might not be correct in their understanding. And we identify what are the key variables, what are the real drivers of the problem. So this is the point at which we've, I suppose, converged on the select few areas for improvement. In the improve phase then, we take those select few areas and we engage the key stakeholders and try and come up with solutions. And again, we use innovation techniques to try and get them to think beyond the usual suspects and, look at the problem from different angles to see, are there better solutions? So the objective here is quantity of solutions, get as many as we can, not find one great solution. So once we get as many as we can, then we can start to weigh them up and identify which solutions are going to be most practical, quickest to implement, most sustainable, and will have the highest impact. In any solution, of course, we're going to have to plan for resistance to change, and we're going to have to look at where that source of resistance might come from, and look at what we have to do to bring people along and overcome that resistance. Obviously, the more we've involved stakeholders all the way through the journey, the easier it will be for us to get a solution accepted and approved and get the buy-in to implement that solution. Then we go into things like risk management and implementing the solution itself, and from there verifying the effectiveness. So all of our change control activities happen here in the improve phase as well, all the documentation and training, etc. And again, at the end of this, we have this is our go live, so this is our saving start date. Most organizations then will start recording the benefits at this point. In the control phase, then we're looking to demonstrate that this is a sustainable solution, that people have bought into this, and that we're not going to have to come back in 6 months' time and redo this. And the other thing, of course, we're looking at is there may be blips along the way. So even though we've implemented a new solution, there may still be some small things that need to be addressed, and we stay with the process until we've addressed all of those small things that need to be bedded down. And then we ensure that the handover of responsibilities has happened. So maybe we've developed new controls, maybe we've developed new techniques, or put in new fixtures or tooling or whatever it is. So all of those have to come back to business as usual, and all of those have to be handed over to their rightful owners. At the very end, and a very important part of this, is then the communication of the learnings from the project. What did we learn about the process? What did we achieve? What were the things that we learned that were out of our control for the purpose of this project, what we recommend should be tackled in the future? And these can often become next generation Greenbelt projects, or sometimes they're just do-its, or sometimes they're IT or capital projects. We document all of these, and in an organization that has a mature program, you might find that in a couple of years you end up with tens or hundreds of these projects, and it goes into a database so that anyone starting out can search based on keyword and find similar projects, so they don't have to invent the wheel again and again. Okay, so just to walk through the body of knowledge for a Greenbelt, I'm just going to take each section and look at the objectives and the tools a bit more closely. So we'll start with the define phase. So again, we have the objectives and the steps in the define phase. We talked about those already. The tools there, so charter is a critical tool. Think of the project charter as the contract. That's the contract between the team and the organization, in particular the sponsor. And usually when we're assessing projects, we want to make sure that the charter is signed off by the sponsor at the end. In other words, the sponsor is happy with the delivery and they'll stand over it. The business case, obviously, what's it going to deliver? There's some tools in there that are standard tools, flowcharts, project plans. Is not is a standard problem-solving tool. Tools like SciPox you mightn't be as familiar with. That's a tool for high-level mapping, understanding the supplier input, process, output, and customer of the process. CT3 is basically understanding the customer requirements. So what's critical to satisfying the customer? And from that, it helps us to identify the metrics. So we might have the primary metric, but we might not have secondary metrics identified. And there might be counter metrics or metrics, things that we don't want to make worse or we don't want to break while we're fixing something else. We call these counter metrics. So we might want to monitor those as well. Obviously, there's a lot of voice of the customer data capture and indeed voice of the business data capture that goes on here as well. And of course, we have to plan for the stakeholder engagement to bring those with us. And lastly, our risk assessment of our project. That looks to see where are the risks in this project. Are there dependencies? Is all the data available? Is it likely that we're going to be able to hit the timeline? And our project plan. What dates will we communicate for the milestones? Moving on to the measure phase, we get into more, if you look at it, it's mapping techniques, it's data collection. In manufacturing environments, you would get into things like process capability, measurement systems analysis, attribute agreement analysis. They're all really about understanding whether we trust the data that we're going to use for diagnostics from the machine or from the process, and understanding to what extent that the process is capable of meeting the customer requirement. Control charts can be used in any process really to see the extent to which the process is stable and repeatable. So an out of control process is a process where we have a lot of what we call special causes that are present, and therefore we can't use statistical methods because the process by nature is not predictable. These special causes are not a predictable activity, they come and go. In which case we know our project is more about historically investigating some of these events and trying to figure out what could have caused them if they're not still happening. Moving to the analyze phase. In the analyze phase, this is where some of the more complex tools might arise. So you get a lot more data analysis tools, root cause analysis tools. So in here in our root cause analysis, we would have the basic tools like our 5 whys. We would also have things like fault tree analysis, which is often used in reliability engineering to try and determine how could this have happened or how could this go wrong. On the data side, we have the graphical analysis tools, and in some cases, but not all green belts required, but in some cases, for example, again, manufacturing industries like pharma, medical device, we would use the tools like hypothesis testing, which are statistical tests. So we can write a protocol, we can set up a trial, and then we can test something versus a control or compare two different things to see statistically is there a difference. And also regression analysis, whereas we try to fit a model. We try to say, does this explain the relationship? And that's that y equals f of x model being fitted. The fishbone diagrams are to help capture and distill the knowledge of the subject matter experts so that we can focus on what are the primary, what does the knowledge tell us is the primary area or the key area. Okay, when we move on to the improve phase, this is again where I said we have the innovation and the implementation. And you see tools like creative thinking techniques. So these are different techniques. One is called Scamper, another is called anti-solutions. They're just different ways of solving problems or coming up with solutions. One of my favorites and one of everyone's favorites, I suppose, is the anti-solutions. It's called a reversal technique. And instead of asking people, how do you fix the problem, what you do is you ask people, how do we break the process? How do we make it worse? And what you find is that that creates a lot of energy because there's no fear associated with coming up with a suggestion for breaking something because it's fun. Everyone likes doing it and they can draw from their own experience of how they might have broken it in the past but mightn't be willing to admit. Whereas if you ask them to come up with a solution to fix the problem, they might be afraid that somebody would critique their solution, or they might be afraid to admit that that they know something about this. So So that's why anti-solutions is often a great one to get lots of solutions quickly. Scamper is a word game. There's lots of other techniques that are used. The pick chart is basically a straightforward tool to prioritize solutions. Pick stands for possible, implement, challenge, and kill. And that's 4 quadrants of the chart. So we look for solutions that are high impact and high feasibility, which are our implement quadrant solutions. On the opposite quadrant, we have the kill ideas, which we're not going to touch. Again, in some organizations, such as the manufacturing, in particular the manufacturing organizations, DOE, or design of experiment, is a way of, I suppose, creating variation in a process to understand the complexity of the process. So what we do is we make changes in the process. We force changes to key variables that we've just identified. And by forcing them to change all at the same time, following a structured matrix, we can see the relationships between them. We can see interactions. We can identify or look at the impacts of the changes beside each other to see which ones are the strongest, which are the biggest effects. And again, a DOE will give us a model. Other tools we have there, FMEA looks at weaknesses in our process. So failure modes and effects analysis, it drives out the risks in the process. And also it helps us to identify opportunities for mistake proofing. So if we see a lot of areas where there's human error, we can say, well, what can we do to minimize the human error? What mistake proofing features can we incorporate to make it harder for people to make a mistake, or indeed to prevent the error from ever happening? A common strategy in the improve phase is to test or pilot the solution. So by checking it in a small area, we can get data quickly, we can refine the solution, we can get buy-in to the solution, and we can use that to demonstrate that it works to other people. So it helps us with our change control as well. On the change control side, we have various tools in there. Force field analysis is an old tool, goes back to the 1940s, I think it goes back to. And another one called stakeholder influence strategies is more for, political change, where there's different stakeholder groups and may have different reasons for being for or against a change, and we want to look at each group independently and see what stakeholders we can leverage and which stakeholders we have to focus on influencing. All of that, of course, comes together in an implementation plan, and once we have our solution in place, then we can start verifying that it works and looking at the impact of the solution. If indeed we're happy with our solution, if we've achieved the goals, then we go on to the control phase. If we're not happy with our solution, if we've not achieved our goals, if we've not gone as far as we think we can go, we may go back to the improve or to the measure or analyze phases to see what we missed. And it's common actually in the DMAIC to go through a phase and find that you might want to go back to another phase. So for example, in the define phase, we're planning out the project, but there's a lot of unknowns. So when we go to the measure phase, we might actually get some answers that we didn't have in the define phase. So it's common to go define, measure, define, and change the scope of the project, or better refine the project charter once we have more information and more data. Or even sometimes you may find out that the problem is not a problem after all, or it's not that big a problem, in which case you might want to kill the project and look for something else. In the control phase, again, we're looking to sustain. So there's a monitoring strategy. We're looking at future-proofing the solution. So future workers coming in, how do we ensure that they're going to do it the right way, and how do we ensure that the solution is standardized? How do we ensure that ownership has been taken and that people understand their responsibilities? And then, of course, the learnings and the feedbacks. Who needs to know about this? What learnings apply to other parts of the organization? So it's common in these projects to look for leverage opportunities. So let's say a project delivers 30,000 euros savings from one area or one team or one line. So then we would look back and say, okay, that's one area, one line. Is there another line with a similar problem, or is there another site with a similar problem? Or could we apply the solution in a different way to solve another problem? So by leveraging the solutions, we can multiply the savings with usually a lot less effort than doing multiple projects. And that's all captured then in the benefits matrix as well. In the benefits, we talk about hard savings, soft savings, and the intangible benefits. So hard savings are typically the things that the accountants want to see. They're the ones that are linked to the bottom line and to our profit and loss. The soft savings are things like freeing up hours for people, making their work easier, things like that. And then you have intangible benefits, things that we weren't expecting, or things that you can't put a number on. So it could be that visibility has improved, or morale has improved, or that we're getting some positive side effects that we weren't expecting. And of course, at the end of the control phase, we would recognize the team, not just the green belt leading the team. Everybody gets recognition, and there's usually a formal event to close out the project. Just there's often a formal event to open the project in the define phase. Okay, let's look at where we are. So we've talked about continuous improvement. We've talked about Lean Six Sigma, and in particular, we've gone through the green belt, methodology, the tools, the journey of the green belt, and the body of knowledge. So if this whets your appetite and you're looking at, okay, I'd like to either become a green belt or maybe look at running a green belt program internally, there's some decisions you have to make, and there's some additional information you need to have, and I'm going to try and give you that now. The first thing is the whole minefield about who to go with and what type of training is appropriate. And the starting point here is the question of whether I go with accredited or non-accredited training. And even that is not as straightforward as you would think. So if we look at accredited training, we can break that into academic accreditation or professional accreditation. So academic accreditation, if we're in Ireland, it means that there's usually something linked to the National Framework of Qualifications. So there's a level to go with it. And usually there's either the QQI, which are the group that used to be HETEC and FETEC, and that sits over all of the institutes of technology, or there's the HEA and the universities. So then if you're going the academic route, you're either going with a university program or a QQI type program. And even with the QQI program, that could be through an institute of technology, or it could be through a private company like SQT. I suppose without banging our drum too much, what I would say about SQT is that the advantage we would have over the purely academic organizations is that we're very much in and out of these companies all the time, so we're very much linked to industry. So it's not just theory with us; it's actually the practice. Our green belt program is level 7. Most others are around level 7. Some are level 8. And usually, if you're going the academic route, you can get credits to other learning. So whereas ours is 15 credits, it varies from 10 to 20 ECTS credits. The other advantage of peer review or of academic accreditation is that generally they're peer reviewed to academic standards. Means you have audited programs, you have external examiners looking over at projects to make sure that there's consistency and fairness, make sure that there's a agreed assessment rubrics, and that the projects are kept to a high standard. And of course, for the institutions themselves, there's programmatic and institutional reviews at periodic intervals. Now, the assessments themselves can be project-based or exam-based. We favor the project-based because it means that the learning is not just in a classroom environment, but most of the learning is actually through the delivery of the project and its practice. And of course, the organization benefits from the project as well. So there's minimum exam activity in our assessment. And certainly for the green belts, our level 7 green belt, there's no exam. It's purely project-based. If you go the professional accreditation route, and for some organizations, they might be multinationals with companies, worldwide, not just in Europe. They might value having the same accreditation in the US and the UK and Ireland and Asia. So you have bodies like the American Society for Quality, the ASQ, that will give you a professional accreditation. And with those bodies, basically what you're doing there is you're demonstrating your knowledge through an exam. And now there's a couple of other bodies that have arisen more recently, the IASSE and the Six Sigma Council. And without saying anything, about those, what I would say is they're a bit they're not as well established as the American Society for Quality. So if I would make a comment between the three, if somebody comes to me and they're ASQ certified, I generally know they know their stuff, though they may still not have completed a project. Whereas I'm not, the other two, there might be question marks over to what extent have they received the appropriate training, to what extent do they really know their stuff. A little bit of research in Google, and you'll figure out soon enough which one to go for. Little oversight of accredited providers. That's something that is a critique, I suppose, of these providers, in that there is no peer review, there is no external examiners or program or institutional reviews for these providers. Generally, they meet some basic criteria and get on an approved list, and off they go. And of course, for most of them, for all of them, they don't look at the projects. Basically, what they look for is they look for an affidavit to say that you've done a project, as opposed to an actual evidence of a project and to see that you understood the tools and technique. Some organizations actually that we work with will do both the academic and the professional. So they will do the ASQ exam after they do the QQI training, and that's only because of the multinational nature of the business. The one thing I would say about professional accreditation is, if you're in a service industry, I would probably avoid this route, because these are generally focused to manufacturing environments. So generally it would force you to learn tools that you're probably not going to use in a service environment. The other route to go is non-accredited training, and this is often suitable because it may be that you're more interested in getting the project done for your organization, and you're going to put a number of people, a team, on this project. And for accreditations, whether it's academic or professional, these are usually individual based. So it's difficult to accredit a team, because you don't know, has one person done more work than another person, has everybody pulled their weight? So the group projects tend to be non-accredited. Other reasons for having non-accredited training is it may be that you want to customize the program. This may be an internal program, or a program that you might want to highly customize to your industry or to your particular company. You may decide that 5 days is too much, and I'm going to cut it back a bit and make it a bit lighter and go to 4 days. Or you may add days. Though normally the addition of days doesn't affect the academic accreditation if you go that route, or the professional accreditation. So again, they're the routes to go through. In terms of SQT's approach, and I'll talk to you about our academic certification. So the requirements for that, first of all, full attendance, obviously, on the training. So you've got to make sure that the candidate was there and demonstrates that they were there for the minimum of the 5 days. Now, in some courses, they may be 6 days, 7 days, 8 days, and that's really just depends on the organization and whether they want to customize or add in tools to the program. For us, our assessment is based on successful project completion, as evidenced by the sponsor sign-off and the achievement of the objectives set out in the project charter. And then for us, we're looking at the actual project submission, and this is usually submitted on Moodle, which is a platform common across colleges and academic institutes as well. And in the project submission, which is often a PowerPoint that reflects the use of the tools and the DMAIC journey, what we're looking for is the appropriate use of tools. Not did you use every tool, or did you try everything? We're looking to see, did you understand which tools were appropriate to your project at that point in your project? Did you make the correct interpretation of the tool? Is the so what of the tool evident? In other words, did you understand the outcome? And obviously the flow. We want to know that you followed the DMAIC and you didn't skip a step. So, for example, there's a huge tendency to go ready, fire, aim. In other words, we have a problem. Let's implement something and see that work. And that's not the DMAIC approach. So we want to make sure that you're not jumping the gun and going straight to solution mode. The other thing about the academic approach, the QQI approach, particularly for us, is that we have a 6-month deadline following the completion of training. And that really focuses the mind for people who are doing these projects. And it helps us to get over that challenge between the urgent and the important, because these projects now have a degree of urgency to them because there's a deadline. And that's a hard date. It's a drop-dead date. If your project is not submitted on Moodle at 4 o'clock on the day in which it's supposed to be submitted, Moodle will shut you out and it's an automatic fail. So these projects have to be, they achieve urgency as the further along you go. And it certainly helps to drive the completion rate up. And we noticed that immediately when we first accredited our program in 2008. Prior to that, it had been non-accredited. Of course, all the way through the training, you have access to tutors, and that's not just in the training, but that's all the way right through to the end of the project submission. So it's really the 6 to 9 month journey that you're on. The projects then have 3 opportunities a year to go through full accreditation. These are through exam boards where the external auditor comes in. And again, we've been tracking these formally since 2008 and tracking the savings and accruing those savings. So we know, for example, prior to our next exam board in October, we've already over 1,000 QQI accredited certified green belts. Now, this is an eye test, but if we were to just take a snapshot from the last 2 exam boards, you may be able to read some of the titles in there, and they're kind of some examples of green belt projects. The other thing you'll notice is that they come across all kinds of sectors. And the other thing you notice is that financial savings are all over the place, that in some cases the savings mightn't be important, or there might be no actual financial saving. The reason might be a strategic reason or a customer satisfaction reason for doing the project, or it might be a soft saving. And in many cases, we mightn't even measure the soft saving. We might say, okay, it's too hard to measure a savings of, an hour a person over 50 people, so we're just not going to bother measuring it. We're just going to say it was a intangible. So most of the savings we see here are hard savings. Occasionally, we will throw in a soft saving where it's very clear and it's very obvious that that this will result in a saving in some other area in the organization. And again, we're capturing, so the average savings there is 70,000 euros over the 1,000 and whatever it is, 75 projects. But you can see it varies. Typically what we see is that service industries, the savings are a little bit lower, so you might be expecting 20, 30,000 in savings. But if you're selling a product and if there's materials going into the product, then usually there's that material saving as well. So usually in the manufacturing environments, those savings can get into the hundreds of thousands or millions even. So it's not unusual for us to come across a project, a greenbelt project. I have one coming through at the moment actually, that will save 2 million. And that will be treated the same way as the project that saved 5,000, because for us it's about the confidence that the person has, the competency that they have to do the next project, not just the project that they're doing today. So do we feel they have the competence to go off and do the next project without all the hand-holding? Just a little word on timing and commitment for green belts. So again, the standard green belt training is over 5 days, though that 5 days for us generally is split up over 8 to 10 weeks. So we would basically align the training to the DMAIC methodology. So the first couple of days would be define a measure. We would take a break for a couple of weeks, give you a chance to gather data, talk to people, plan out the project, and then come back and look at your data in the analyze phase and try and help you crunch that data and try and help you focus on a strategy to narrow the focus of the project. And then go away again for a few weeks and come back maybe a month later and look at the improve phase. So what did your trials tell you? What did your analysis tell you? And then in the improve phase, we can start working out what do you need to do or what strategies do you need to pursue in order to come up with a solution. And then from there, of course, we're with you all the way to the end of the project. It's important that the project charters are submitted in advance of training, because this is the chance for us to see, are you trying to solve world hunger? Have you got a good metric? Are you missing something here? Are you, is this a suitable project? Usually we find that the bulk of our projects are completed early, so they're completed with a month or two to spare and that's something we strive for, so that people aren't under pressure trying to get the project submitted, with a week to go, or indeed on the day. So Greenbelt commitment itself. So if you're doing a Greenbelt project, most companies would say, "Oh, we'll give you 20% of your time." But generally speaking, what I would find is that usually the commitment varies from 10 to 20%, and it's up and down from week to week. So some weeks you're going to have less time to commit, and there's going to be less requirement for commitment of time, and other weeks you're going to have more time. Outside of the Greenbelt commitment, of course, the team member themselves usually have to commit some time, and of course that can be a lot less. Greenbelt teams tend to be small teams, 4 to 7 people. Usually depends on how many functions are involved in the project. These are all cross-functional projects. And what you find is that there's a core team, maybe 3 or 4 people or 4 or 5 people, and then there could be an extended team, people that we pull in when we need them at various points. It could be for workshops or whatever. So the team member commitment is usually less than 5% per team member, and that might still mount up to somewhere between 20 and 40 hours over the life of the project per team member. So there's still a reasonably significant commitment. But what it might be is that you could be asking somebody to collect data on the process that they're working in. So maybe that some of the time could be spent while they're actually doing their work, as opposed to in a team meeting. Team meetings tend to be set at a cadence. So every week we would expect that the team would meet for at least an hour or half an hour, just to make sure that progress is being made and make sure that they're on the right track, or it could be to work on one of the knowledge base tools or to plan the next step. And of course, that all assumes that the Greenbelt project is getting the support from the organization, so that people, that the roadblocks are not being put up in front of the team members or the team leader, and that the time is available for them to work on the project, and that they have access to, if it's a machine that they're working on, they have access to the machine, or they have access to run their trials, or access to the materials, or whatever it is. In the service industry, it's often access to data, that they can get the reports run to be able to do the analysis. Okay, so the last thing I'll leave you, I suppose, with is some success factors. So again, I mentioned the projects, and project selection is critical, and I'm just reiterating that here, that we can tell in advance if a group of 10 people come to us for training. We can pick out the ones where they're going to struggle just by looking at the project charters, because we'll know which ones are high risk and which ones are reasonably low risk. Now that doesn't mean that we won't allow a high risk project to continue, as long as there is a risk mitigation plan in place, and as long as we feel that it's not a world hunger project and it's a doable project. And of course, that's where scoping comes in, is keeping the project down to that narrowest possible focus and avoiding dependencies where we can. It's not always possible to avoid dependencies. There may be an IT element or an external supplier or another site involved in the project, and our strategy there would be to seek commitment for the resources required from that dependent entity. Another key success factor is data. So even in the service world, we need data. So and one of the challenges might be, if you look at a financial services environment, a lot of the data might come in monthly cycles. Therefore, if you're looking at how well our month-end closure is working, you have one data point a month, and that makes it very difficult for you to do any changes, and because you have to wait a month to see did that work. So typically what we try and do is look for data where it's available in weekly intervals, or in some sort of operational format that we can follow. And obviously the data has to have good degree of integrity, though not all data doesn't have to be 100% clean in order for the significant things to come out of it. So it doesn't mean you have to cleanse the data or it has to be perfect. It just means that we have a reasonable expectation of the integrity of the data. The support of the team, obviously, we talked about our support for the team. We talked about that they have the time from their managers. Mentoring support internally and externally is important. Usually for organizations starting out, they may not have black belts, so we would also provide that role, the black belt role. Over time, the organizations will develop those roles themselves. In many organizations, what they do is, and 1 year you will do your green belt training, and the next year you will become the mentor for the next person who's doing their green belt training, so that you'll remember the journey you went on and help them along their journey, and also helps your development as a green belt. And of course, that your sponsor is there when you need your sponsor, and usually that's at the start of the project. When we get to the improve phase, if there's any obstacles to overcome or any resources that need to be committed, and at the end of the project where we want to close out the project, recognize people and celebrate the success, and also leverage the benefits. It's critical that we bring the organization along on this journey. So the soft stuff is the hard stuff, really, in these projects. Without involving people from the coal face, from the process, we call this the target area for the change. Without involving people from the target area, without involving subject matter experts or key stakeholders in the journey right from the outset, it can result in a risk for us later on in the project. So it's important we engage at all different levels in the organization, and that's where the communication comes in. So green belts need to be able to communicate upwards, sideways, downwards, all different levels, and through different media. Communication planning is important, and again, that's something that for some green belts they have it, and other green belts just need to learn some techniques and some strategies. So thanks for your time today. I'll just leave you with the link to SQT Training's website and the phone number. And if you go in there, what you'll find is that we have lots of more information and brochures and FAQs, and you can, of course, call us directly. There's always somebody at the end of the number, and we'll be happy. One of the tutors will be happy to call you back if we're not available at the time. So good luck on your career development, and hope to see you in my classroom in the future.